Let's go through a few more examples of functions and then how we could write them in Scala. So we looked at the most basic of functions, something that takes a single value and then gives us back a square of that value. We should be a little bit more specific about some terminology. The thing that is passed in here, this is called a formal parameter. And what you note about this is at the point where we write this function, x does not have a value. X could be anything that is a proper double. Okay? It's not until we call the function, and this here, the value that we specify is called the argument. When we specify the argument to the function, that gives a value to the formal parameter, and then that value is used for evaluating the function. So you can see how when we call this square of 3, x takes on the value of 3, and we get back 9. When we call it with 4, x takes on the value of 4, and we get back 16. What if we have more than one parameter? So to define a somewhat nonsensical function that doesn't really do much of anything, we'll declare a function that takes an a and a b, which are both integers, and returns to us another integer, and that integer will be 3 times a minus b. And once again, no particular reason for using this function, but we want to have it as an example. So this function now takes two parameters, and we have to pass two things into it. In this case, they both happen to be ints. There is no rule that says that your types have to be the same. You could have 10 arguments and they could all have different types for the function. And then when I call this, I specify my arguments. So for example, 2 and 3, in which case I get 3 times 2, which is 6 minus 3, and that gives us 3 as our result. So those are some fairly simple examples. We've written some code in previous videos that could be converted nicely over into using functions. So for example, if I copy, we had an example where we entered in a time that was had a number colon another number colon another number, and then we wrote some code that would figure out how many hours, minutes, and seconds there were from that. And then in this case, it also gave us total seconds. I want to take and I want to break this down in such a way that we use some functions to evaluate this, to do the same thing. Because maybe I want to do this in multiple places in a program. If I were writing a large program and either users were entering times or I was getting times from some other data source, I might have to do this operation of either breaking it apart or figuring out a total number of seconds. I might have to do that a lot. Okay, and so the first thing the function allows us to do is to put our code into a single chunk that we can call many times with different arguments. And it's that with different arguments that really gives you the additional power. Just being able to call it multiple times isn't quite as helpful, though it does prevent you from doing a lot of cut and paste, and that's a good thing. So I'm going to actually break this down into two steps. One step is going to calculate the hours, minutes, and seconds, and I will define that as one function. So we'll call that break down time, and it takes the time as a string, and it's going to return. Now this one's actually almost kind of a little challenging. I need to return three things. I want the hours, the minutes, and the seconds. So how can I represent a type that holds three values in it? Well, hopefully you remember that there's a nice way to do that in Scala, and that's with a tuple. So we're going to return a 3 tuple of int, int, int. And what I want to have happen in here is basically what happens on these 5 lines. So I'm going to take those 5 lines, and I'm going to move them up into here. And because they are now inside of a function, because they are inside of the curly braces here, I'm going to indent them. We definitely want to be indenting our code. It makes things much easier to read. And we have to return a 3 tuple from here. We have to give back hours, minutes, seconds. That is the result of calling this function. Now once I have those 3 values, I could calculate total seconds. And so another possible function here would be to calculate total seconds. Now I could have it so that total seconds takes time as a string, or I could have it so it takes the 3 different ints. Actually, I could write both, but how I write it depends upon how it's going to be used. For this example, I'm actually going to make it so it takes the 3 different values. Hours, which is an int, minutes, which is an int, and seconds, which is an int. And it's going to return to us another int. And it is basically this line of code. Now, because there is only one thing happening in this function, I don't need to declare a variable and then return that variable. I can just have this one expression here, which means technically I could have gotten rid of the curly braces, but I think that this type of function, especially because if I move it all up to one line, it's going to be too long. I think it's easier to read this way, with the curly braces and the code indented. So now if I want to use these functions, I can say val, and here I'm going to use the pattern matching and assignment into a tuple. And I'm going to say hours, minutes, seconds equals breakdown time of time. Now, it just so happens that this time here, that time is this time. It happens to be the same name I used up here, but that does not have to be the case. Okay, I can call the formal parameter anything that I want. Just like when I called f of 3 or square of 3, I didn't have to say x equals 3 first. I just called it. I happen to be using the same variable name because it's a meaningful variable name, because time is what we're dealing with here. And then instead of doing the calculation here, I will call total seconds of hours, minutes, seconds. Now in this case, there is something that worries me a little bit. I have 2 things that have exactly the same name here. I actually think I like total seconds better for the val, so I'm going to change this to calc total seconds. That way I don't have any potential for having a conflict, because they're both at the global scope. Okay, this is out at the top level and this is out at the top level, and if they have the same name, that could cause problems for me. So let's save that, and we'll run it. And so I can say 10 hours, 10 minutes, and 10 seconds, and it outputs 36,610. So this has demonstrated a number of things. We have a function that takes 1 argument and returns a 3 tuple. We have a function that takes 3 arguments and returns a single value. We use these functions to break down. We had a larger problem here, and we broke it into 2 smaller problems. One problem that pulls apart the string and gives us back the 3 values, and a second problem that takes the 3 values and combines them. Okay? And we created these functions. Note that these functions don't read anything from input and they don't print anything. They return to us, and this is far more useful. We'll come back to that point a number of times.